Everyone was certain they knew how this story would end. The experts were confident. Investors were confident. Governments were confident. Entire industries were confident. The future belonged to electric vehicles. Every major headline pointed in the same direction. Every conference presentation repeated the same message. The companies moving fastest toward a fully electric future would dominate the next generation of transportation. Everyone else would be left behind. And for a while, that prediction looked impossible to challenge. New EV startups appeared almost overnight. Battery factories worth billions of dollars were announced across continents. Traditional automakers rushed to unveil ambitious plans, each trying to prove they were more committed to electrification than the last. Then there was Toyota. While competitors raced forward, Toyota seemed to do something nobody expected. It slowed down at first. That decision looked almost unbelievable. This wasn't a small company struggling to keep up. This was the company that had built one of the most successful automotive empires in history. The company that had transformed manufacturing, the company that had introduced millions of people to hybrid technology long before electric vehicles became fashionable, and yet, when the entire industry appeared to be running toward the same destination, Toyota refused to join the sprint. Critics called it stubbornness. Investors called it a mistake. Some analysts wondered whether the company had simply lost its ability to recognize where the future was heading. The criticism grew louder every year, because from the outside, the numbers didn't look good. Tesla's valuation exploded. Electric vehicle sales climbed. Governments announced aggressive timelines to reduce dependence on traditional engines. Meanwhile, Toyota kept talking about hybrids, efficiency, and multiple technological pathways. To many observers, it sounded like a company trapped in the past. But inside Toyota, engineers weren't asking the same questions everyone else was asking. While competitors focused on how quickly they could replace gasoline vehicles, Toyota became obsessed with a different question, a question almost nobody wanted to discuss. What if the transition doesn't happen the way everyone expects? Not in carefully controlled presentations, not in wealthy cities filled with charging stations, not in marketing campaigns. In the real world, the uncomfortable reality was that most people didn't live in places where charging infrastructure appeared overnight. Most people didn't buy vehicles based on ideology. Most people bought vehicles because they needed transportation that worked every day. And Toyota couldn't stop thinking about that at the time. Raising those questions felt almost dangerous. The industry had already chosen its narrative: electric versus gasoline, future versus past, innovation versus tradition. The story was simple, too simple, because reality rarely stays simple for long. And Toyota believed that one day, reality would force everyone to confront the details they were currently ignoring. But that only mattered if Toyota was right. And for years, nobody knew the answer. The pressure to follow the crowd became enormous. Imagine standing in a stadium where millions of people suddenly begin running toward the same exit. Even if you have doubts, following them feels safer than standing still. That's what was happening across the automotive industry. The momentum became self-reinforcing. The more companies committed to electric vehicles, the more investors rewarded them. The more investors rewarded them, the more competitors felt pressured to join. Soon, questioning the direction of the market became almost unthinkable. Yet Toyota kept moving differently, not because it believed electric vehicles would fail. That was never the argument. The company believed something far less dramatic, that transportation might be too complicated for a single solution. And that one assumption changed everything. Because once Toyota accepted that possibility, its priorities shifted completely. Instead of asking how to eliminate gasoline vehicles immediately, engineers began asking how transportation could evolve step by step. Instead of betting everything on one technology, they started examining multiple possibilities simultaneously. And while critics interpreted that approach as hesitation, Toyota saw it as preparation. Preparation for a future that might look very different from the one everyone was predicting. At first, there was no evidence they were right. In fact, every visible sign suggested the opposite. Electric vehicle momentum continued growing. Consumer excitement remained high. Media coverage became increasingly enthusiastic. If Toyota was making a mistake, the consequences could be enormous. But then something unexpected happened. Not a collapse, not a crisis, just small cracks, tiny questions. The kind of questions people ignore until they become impossible to ignore. Charging projects faced delays, infrastructure costs increased. Some regions struggled to expand networks as quickly as expected. Consumers began encountering challenges that rarely appeared in advertisements. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, but enough to make people pause. And once people pause, they start asking questions. What happens during a long road trip? What happens when chargers aren't available? What happens when convenience becomes more important than idealism? Those questions didn't immediately change the market, but they started changing consumers. And this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable, because while much of the industry was focused on building larger batteries, Toyota had spent years solving a different problem: efficiency. Not the kind that generates excitement on social media, the kind that quietly improves everyday life. Toyota engineers became obsessed with squeezing more usefulness from every unit of energy. Whether that energy came from gasoline, electricity, or a combination of both mattered less than one thing: making transportation easier. The goal wasn't to create technology people admired. The goal was to create technology people stopped thinking about, because the best technology often becomes invisible. You don't celebrate it, you simply depend on it. And Toyota believed that dependence would matter more than excitement over the long term. At the time, few people paid attention. Bigger batteries made better headlines, futuristic designs generated more clicks, acceleration records attracted more attention. Efficiency felt boring by comparison, until consumers started calculating costs, until businesses started managing fleets, until families started comparing ownership experiences. Then suddenly, efficiency didn't seem boring anymore. It seemed valuable. And that shift would change everything, because consumers weren't just evaluating vehicles anymore. They were evaluating lifestyles. They wanted reliability, predictability, affordability, confidence, qualities that rarely dominate headlines but often dominate purchasing decisions. Toyota understood this because it had spent decades studying how people actually use vehicles. Millions of cars, billions of miles, every climate, every road condition, every imaginable scenario. Each success created data. Each failure created lessons. And over time, those lessons became an advantage competitors couldn't easily replicate. While newer companies focused on building the future, Toyota quietly studied the present. That difference sounded small. It wasn't single quotes, because eventually the market started asking a question nobody expected. What if the best solution isn't the most revolutionary one? What if it's the one that works for the most people? Suddenly, the conversation began changing. Buyers became less interested in looking futuristic, more interested in avoiding problems, less interested in maximum performance, more interested in total ownership. Costs, less interested in promises, more interested in practicality. And Toyota was already positioned exactly where that conversation was heading. Not because it predicted every detail, but because it never assumed the future would be simple. That's what made the company's strategy so unusual. Toyota never argued that electric vehicles lacked advantages. They clearly had advantages: lower emissions, instant torque, reduced maintenance in many situations. The company acknowledged all of it. What, Toyota questioned, was something deeper. Whether advantages alone determine adoption. History suggested they don't. Reality does, and reality is messy. Different countries develop differently. Different consumers prioritize different things. Different infrastructures grow at different speeds. What works perfectly in one place may struggle somewhere else. Toyota built its strategy around that complexity. Most competitors built theirs around certainty. Years later, that distinction started looking far more important than anyone expected, because the biggest mistake industries make isn't choosing the wrong technology. It's assuming there can only be one answer. And that leaves us with a question that still hasn't been fully answered. When the future finally arrives, will the winners be the companies that predicted it most accurately, or the companies that prepared for multiple versions of it at the same time?